Welcome to the Under the Hat podcast,
the show where we talk about everything and anything that is top of mind in education.
The goal is to provide meaningful conversations to what is currently happening in our classrooms.
Stories, pains,
moments of success.
We want to hear it all.
Friends, I am back in the chair. I've been out for, I think, at least 2 episodes for things like a 5K, sick, stuff of that nature. Sophie, though, is gone for this episode. So just the way things have turned out. She's on her way back from FETC, so she's literally up in the air. But I'm super pumped to be here. I get to chat and we get to hear and learn alongside the phenomenal Nate Ridgway. Nate, thanks for being here, sir.
Thanks so much for having me. Phenomenal is a strong word, but I appreciate it.
No. I've always been, like looking at your work, looking at your perspective in education. I know that it's our first time meeting face to face, but your work has always resonated with me, with someone that appreciates the leveling the playing field in education. Things like project-based learning, and we were both history teachers as far as
yes.
So and just really excited for the conversation. And before we really get things going, Nate, we're going to talk a lot about what you're currently working on in a bit, but very keen to hear, where you came from and what your journey was into education.
Yeah. So, so hi, everybody. I'm Nate Ridgway. So I am a decade into educating now, I'll say. So I, kind of how I came to the education career was a lot for my family. My grandfather was a school superintendent out in Western Indiana, which is where I am right now. And then my mom was a university professor who taught people how to become teachers. So let's just say there was a lot of influence going, in that direction in terms of my career goals, right? However, when I wanted to become a teacher, I was like, I want to become a music educator. I'm really passionate about music. I had done, the whole band thing in high school, and I was like, I want to do that for kids. And then I got into college and realized that was just a gigantic hole of black time. Was doing music in college, and so I was like, maybe not that. I go with my second passion, which is history. And so I started off in history. And I also got my specialization in special ed. Because I was very passionate about providing, equitable learning opportunities for students who were neurodivergent or, diverse learners. And so my first gig was actually a special education position. And then I transitioned after a year of doing that to just history teaching for about the next 8 years. And now, since doing that, I transitioned to the private sector, and I've also picked up doing some teaching at the university level at my alma mater, which is the University of Indianapolis. So, yes, it's been quite a ride.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but what's really interesting is your story is very similar to mine, as I actually started in music ed first.
Oh, there you
go. And then transitioned into social studies. So I was listening to, I was like, that's kind of interesting.
Yep.
But yeah, no. So special ed, I think that's such an important piece of conversation that I don't know that we're preparing teachers for. And what I mean by that is I remember getting an ounce of training in the credentialing levels, and how I did a lot of my learning around it once I was in the profession, and awesome, right? There's PD on it.
Yeah.
But being someone that kind of, like you mentioned, training teachers, that's the space that I'm in. I do find it interesting how we're not we do and we don't. It's we're peppering this thing in, but it's not too extensive.
It's breadth, not depth, right? And that's something too that I've become increasingly concerned as I've seen the educator pipeline become really restricted. And as here in Indiana, and this is happening in other states as well, is that the bar to become a teacher is just kind of continually getting lowered and lowered. Well, unfortunately, sometimes one of the first things to go in terms of our teacher educator prep programs is work on how to help students who are, who have learning disabilities. They might have autism, who knows, right? But the tendency that I have seen is that the amount of prep and training on that has either increased with some schools of education becoming more aware of the issue, or with some states, state board of educations on like the policy side of things, I've seen more like, we just need to get people, like we need bodies in classrooms. And then that kind of becomes more or less like an afterthought, which is again, to the detriment of all those students and their families. Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, like when I started to like doing the sped work, for me, it was a big like social justice component, because I just really wanted to make sure that the students who I had under my wing were able to still enjoy the same, activities and academic opportunities and skill-based learnings and, who knows what, right. As their peers. So.
Yeah. And I don't want to make an assumption or put words in your mouth, but was it useful to do sped first and then go into a content? Like I'm just thinking that probably
it really was, because like the amount of like teachers who I would work with, especially like once I started like on like the book circuit and started like interacting with people who are outside of my immediate school building, like the amount of school teachers who would like, I would say like, hey, like, so like tell me what you know about RTI, right? And they'd be like, I don't know what that means, right? Or like I would, again, UDL isn't necessarily connected to special ed, but it does have a lot, that kind of parallels with it. I would say like, hey, so like tell me about like how does your how do you help your students with social needs address some, like how do you address that through like an UDL lens? And they're like, I have no idea what UDL is. Right. So like, I feel like there's some things that by the very process of you going through the special education, just pipeline, that you become much more aware of some, I'll say like mental constructions that you need to be aware of. And then that's also, there's a whole bunch of policy things that you become really, really aware of too. Right. Because then you understand like the impact, that like, progress monitoring has. You have a much better, I think, than maybe just your, I'm going to say like vanilla educator, which there's no such thing, but vanilla educator, like then like the impact of like data and like how that's tracked through a system. Right. So like, I think there's a few different things there that kind of like a special education mind is more aware of when they first enter a classroom than if you weren't taught that way.
Yeah. And I remember, and I know I've shared this before on the show, but towards the end of me being in the high school classroom before I left, I did have a student teacher who, she came in with like, this is what teaching is. Like she had this like this perspective of like, oh, I really love history, so I'm going to lecture at kids, and then hopefully they get excited. And like she had like more of like an old school mindset going in. No fault on her though, just like part of the system. And she came into my classroom, and she like we were kind of talking about modifications, accommodations, and she's like, Steve, I feel like you provide it to everyone. And I'm like, yeah, if you provide it to everyone, that burden of like having however many IEP students or however many English language learners or like whatever, all the other, diversity that's in the classroom, that is less of a burden now, because if you do it for all, then it just, and that's where like during my earlier years, I had no idea what UDL was, but I was doing it. Purely because there was like that level of compassion, right?
Yeah. And the truth be told, like that's something like when I've gone and I've talked to schools and educators before, they're like, oh God, now we have to do this like UDL thing that he's talking about. It's like in 95% of the circumstances, you're probably already doing something that falls under that framework. Right. And like oftentimes it's just giving you the, like either the research-based background to know that, yes, you really are having like a very powerful impact through your teaching, and you're doing like good, good UDL work, even though you may not call it that. Right.
Right. But well, and so I've seen it done both ways, and I've delivered UDL. And let's just talk about that. Like when I deliver a PD, I've done it in the past where, the graphics that they have, like where it has all the verbiage.
Yeah.
When I first started training on it, I would show people that, and it was just like, nope. Like,
the eyes glaze over immediately. Yeah.
Glaze over. I've been like in the last couple years have really just been leaning into, I don't even say UDL. I just show them how, like, hey, I'm like, hey, here's a few strategies that I used. And they're like, oh, that's really smart. Or, hey, oh, that makes it way more accessible. Or this idea of giving choice, right? And representation and like, and how engagement can change. And so to me, like once you get the hook, they're like, you're probably already doing some of this. But how can we like dial things up a little bit?
Yeah, and usually, like, I found the exact same thing when I start talking with educators directly about like, okay, so like here's the outcomes that this is going to deliver, because adult-based learners are very need focused, right? Like we only typically adult learners, according to Malcolm Knowles, we tend to focus on things that we need to know, and that's what we then focus on our learning energies towards, right? And as soon as you say like, well, your learners are craving for some kind of agency in the classroom, and you're like, oh, I see through this strategy, I'm empowering them, right? Like all of a sudden lights start turning on. But as soon as you're like, let's learn about a framework, again, it's just nothing happens. Yeah, because it's because there's not a need base to know, right? And yeah, so like I think there's kind of a couple keywords that I always kind of hone in on with folks when I'm doing like PD or talking with folks about it. Like one is the agency word that I mentioned. I think the other is like choice, which again is something that kind of oftentimes just directly correlates to agency. Multiple is usually another one. So like how I'll have kids be able to do this through multiple ways. Again, I'm not talking about, the UDLs and CAS, like little framework. I'm just, picking verbiage out of it that kind of tends to be a little bit more sticky with folks. And then the other one is like, engagement obviously is something that a lot of educators are increasingly focused about and are, increasingly just ed tech driven life. It's like sometimes there's, like the educators just need a hook, right? To bring kids back to what we were, doing at that moment. So,
yeah. And there seems to be like we're like all over the place, right? With UDL. And what I mean by that is like, at least in my state, something that, at least in like the last 20 years is literacy, right? Like, like if you talk to an educator in California, they will tell you something about literacy and how they're implementing it, how they're supporting their students with it. With the UDL though, not to say that they're the exact same thing, but like you'll have some teachers that were like, oh yeah, I've gotten the training, or oh, I've never even heard of that. I'm kind of interested in like what, like, do you see that changing? Are you hopeful of like making it more mainstream, I guess, if I can put it that way?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that are kind of helping push that along. Is like one is just simple like time and awareness, right? Like sometimes, even though CAS has been around for a really long time, and UDL has by proxy been around for a long time too. Just as more educators, like as we know better, we do better, right? So there's just kind of just been this generally organic spread of information as other people besides like the Carolyn Tomlinsons of the world, who are like, the main folks on differentiation, and other people have like written about these things. We just simply know more information. And then we know that that UDL has an impact, right? So like people then start to pay more attention to it. I think the other thing that's made it, and this is a big thing, but I do have like an asterisk next to it, is also that with UDL and differentiation, I'm going to kind of lump those together right now. That for a lot of educators, one of them, like probably the main fear that I heard about trying to implement like either a differentiated classroom or a kind of a UDL based classroom was simply the amount of time that it would take. The thing that has helped, I think, ameliorate some of those concerns, but I only say this is true for like a small percentage of educators, is AI, because that has given them a little bit more of essentially it's taken a few items off of the plate of them being able to get like ideas and brainstorms about like how they can better differentiate this for their students, or they might have an app that can differentiate readings for them really, really quickly, right? There's lots of things out there that can do that. There's Magic School AI has stuff on that, CurryPod has stuff on that. There's too many AI applications right now that have all these potentials. Diffit is another one, right? Yeah. That have all this potential for helping us do differentiation and UDL work better. that all being said, and this is kind of my asterisk with that, one, obviously there's, a lot of concerns about like, am I actually truly doing better UDL work with those applications in hand? Like unfortunately, there's still just not enough scientific literature that exists yet about whether these applications actually do provide an actual change in efficacy regarding about how we provide UDL and differentiation. We just don't have it yet. The literature isn't there. It hasn't been around for long enough. And then two, it's still a minority of educators, and we still have a lot of educators, for very rightful reasons, for a lot of them, who aren't able to implement those tools in their classroom or have hesitations about doing so, and so those kind of, again, that's why I kind of put that asterisk next to that, that for some of us, it's becoming a little bit more accessible because of those particular technologies.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. And kind of like what I've heard, at least as of late, is like, where are we going to get balance between the artificial and the human intelligence, right?
Yeah.
Because
that's a big concern for me too.
And because I mean, what I guess what I wouldn't want is for teachers to lose. So let's say I go into a magic school and I develop something, or I have it develop something. And while that's lovely and saves time, I still want the human eye on it to make that final call.
Yeah.
I worry that we're going to do less of that because even if it's generating something in, I don't know, in Indiana, that should look different if the same exact output is happening in California, right?
Yep. And I'm one of those people, and I follow a lot of thought leaders on this who have concerns about equity and AI, just broadly speaking. So Ken Shelton has a really good book that he's recently released on this that I would recommend to folks that they read. And then if you're looking for other like practical solutions, there's authors out there too who have looked more at the practical side of leveraging this technology, but more diving into like the philosophical, keeping the human touch on things. Yeah, that's a really, really big concern for me overall. One is that similar to like how parents are the experts on their kids, you as a teacher, you are the expert on how your students learn, not an AI machine. And again, I really, really caution educators out there that just, it's an algorithm, right? It's similar to, essentially word salad. You put something into it and then it's going to, pull from whatever sample data that it has. And hopefully that sample data is been rigorously vetted for equity and, and for biased content. And that hopefully then you're hoping it magically comes together into something that is going to be a resource for your kids. Now, does that mean that it can't have an outside perspective that comes in and adds like, oh, like that's a moment. I never thought about doing that activity with my kids. Sure, absolutely. Right. Like like I am all down for having any outside perspective, human, AI, like come in and say like, hey, have you thought about like, trying this particular activity or reading? Right. But at the end of the day, like there's one really expert on how your kids learn, and that's you. And that has to be kept in mind.
No, I love that perspective of like just what these different stakeholders bring in terms of value, and being very clear and transparent of how we use that value. And with respect to this conversation around AI, I would like, Nate, if you don't mind, to transition a little bit on the work you've done as an author. And so I do know that you do have 2 books out. And so the first one is Ditch That Tech. Curious to hear first just a little bit about that one and how that one came about.
Yeah, so that one was so back in I think we started that book off in 2017. We kind of like started mulling the idea around. So this is pre-AI, right? In terms of like widespread, people's awareness of those things. So just kind of like move that off into a segmented area of your brain for a second. And I was working as a high school history teacher at that time. I hadn't started universitying at that point, if I can use that as a verb. And as I was working with my kids, like like our district was implementing a lot of ed tech in the classroom. Like this is like the prime time when like people were beginning to transition out of like the smart board era, I'll call it, which was like a little bit, like a few decades earlier, give or take. And like they were actually starting to look at like, okay, what if we give every kid a Chromebook? And I, and then also my mom, who was, again, a professor of education, were like, so what are you gonna do? Like, what's the playbook? Like, you can't just you can't just hand every kid a device and then expect like that automatically teachers are going to know the best way to use these things, and neither are students, right? And so then with that idea in mind, we went to Matt Miller, who my mom had run and circulated around at conferences before, and so the three of us wrote that book together. And so it is the third in the Ditch That Textbook series. So if you've heard of Ditch That Textbook, and then there was Ditch That Homework, which he did with Alice Keeler, and then this one, which all three of us did together. So basically what the book did is we really wanted to sit down and we wanted to look at, could you come up with a handbook for how these devices could be used in the most effective way possible to help meet students' needs? And so we looked at that from a few different perspectives. We had seen other models out there about how teachers should use tech in their classroom. Some of them we were, kind of inspired by, others not so much. We had seen there were a lot of them on how students in particular should be using their particular devices. And so we decided that we wanted to focus more on the teacher side of things, about how could the teachers leverage the technology in order to help meet student needs. So we were going to kind of take that particular angle on it. And that was kind of the generation of that book. So we came up with an actual framework that teachers can follow. And I can give you just a really quick rundown of it. It's pretty simple, which is, so as a teacher, we kind of go from like the most teacher-centered use of the technology all the way down to the most student-centered use of the technology. And what that looks like, so kind of like the top tier, you have like teacher-led use of technology. So that would be things that like a teacher would have in front of the room. So and we actually gave names to all these things, which was another kind of fun activity. And we gave them like archetypes and roles that teachers could refer to. But the first one was basically like, if the teacher's standing up at the front of the room and they're just using the technology in front of them, like a PowerPoint or similar to a Kahoot or something like that, right? And it's like, the students are sitting there passively observing what's going on, but it's really the teacher who's driving the bus, right? And then we go from that all the way to then the tech becomes interactive. And I think we call that role the museum exhibitor role, because like if you go to like a museum nowadays, like a kid's museum, like everything's tangible and playable. And even though it's still the teacher who's leading the activity or choosing the content that kids are interacting with, the kids are now getting to play with it a little bit. So Kahoot might even fall into here, right? Because like kids are, obviously pecking away at their own computers. But there's lots of different examples of this out there. It's like a Pear Deck might fall under this, right? Like where kids are interacting with the tech there. But again, still the teacher deciding what the content is, how they're going to interact with it, et cetera, et cetera. And then we get down to where then the content itself starts to become, so teacher-led content to it's interactive. Now we're going to start to add maybe that the process, not the content, the process of how the students are going to interact with it is going to be up to them. So maybe they have a few different options, like a menu, we call this the restaurant owner role, that they can choose from, that they would decide to go with, right? And then we went to the council member, which was the students are getting to vote on you're differentiating by content at that point. You're letting the kids decide. And then the last one that we added in kind of at the very, very most student-centered role is that the students are fully empowered. They're deciding how and the ways in which they learn. And Carolyn Tomlinson is kind of the kind of some of the basis of a little bit of this model. But we're also then providing really, really high-end metacognitive based feedback for kids and kind of like helping them take that moment to reflect and think about the learning that they're doing. And we call that the creative art coach role. So anyway, so that was kind of the generation of that book. So really specifically, we were just kind of looking at how the teacher is utilizing that technology in the classroom, and kind of that was our main drive for how we could better address student needs.
Yeah. That's all that. And what I find most interesting about all that is that just how relevant all of that still is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's all still there. Half the apps that we described in it are gone, but hey, that happens, right? So like, I think we were joking about it after it came out, because you were like, within like 2 months, like one of the apps that was on there died, just because, like, these things happen, right? Like, people's, decide to, sell an app off to somebody else and they kill it, right? Rip Skype, right? But you kind of get the idea, right? And so like, we were just kind of giggling about it afterwards, but all the principles of what that book was there and talking about and advocating for are still very true.
Yeah. No, like quick little side note. I was at a conference a few months ago where I wasn't exhibiting, which is kind of rare. So I got to go like attend sessions. And mind you, it's been like I'm coming up on almost 3 years now that I've been out of the classroom. And all of these sessions that I attended, I'm like, all of these things were not around. Like, I'm talking about like the tools, like the companies, and working for a company like Cami, like I know Cami like inside and out. But when you go and you attend and you're like, you just want to go learn, I'm like, wait, what's a class companion? Like there's like all these things now where, like, you're right, like anything that we document or curate, or like in your case, like your writing, you're like, oh cool, it was gone last week, sweet.
Yeah, I know, and that's why I've always been very hesitant to write books about applications specifically, because and this is why, like, for all the poor people who wrote about Flipgrid, right, which was this amazing application that Microsoft had that and again, for folks who, if there's an educator out there who doesn't know Flipgrid, I'm very surprised, but and maybe you must be like brand spanking new to the profession, but Flipgrid was this like amazing application where students could, like, basically do like video entries back and forth between each other and teachers and students. And it was amazing. And educators loved it. I knew a lot of people on the Flipgrid team, like, very directly. And when Microsoft, eventually axed them, this past year, like, it was just kind of like left this huge void there. And so, like, I'm always hesitant to write a book about like a very specific application and all the different ways to use it, because like those things can disappear really fast.
Yeah. And it had the community piece of it, right? That I think, no doubt. So you have the second book, which I love the title.
Oh, I just realized I don't have it behind me.
Oh no, it's good. And hopefully I don't butcher this, but like, so
you're fine.
Breaking the blockbuster model.
Yeah.
Using edtech and accessibility to see what's next in classrooms. So just so many thoughts go into my head. And by the way, I apologize. I've not read.
You're fine.
I've read your first one, but like the blockbuster one, I've always wanted to pick up, because I'm like, ooh,
I'll send you a copy.
Yeah. Like, ooh, blockbuster. Yeah, I really appreciate that. So tell us a little bit about that, and kind of like, I'm very keen to hear about like the thematic component of all that.
Yeah, so like this idea actually came back to me like in a blog post on a Now Since like blog that I don't utilize anymore. Since I've shifted over to the name of to this one. But I kind of got hooked on this idea that I felt like there was some things about our teaching that were really antiquated, that were in desperate need of a refresh. And I thought about Blockbuster being a really good metaphor for kind of like what like what that kind of looks and feels, and then what that eventually in the future, and then we can talk about kind of the last chapter of the book, about what that kind of would manifest itself like. And the reason why I wanted to pick that title and why I decided to go down that route is because I think for a lot of folks who are trying to pick up a book for the first time, it's a lot easier to understand something metaphorically sometimes than it is through like an artificially like created framework, or like somebody's writing who doesn't seem to have like a driving idea behind it, right? And so I felt like this was going to be a really, really effective vehicle for discussing essentially like in kind of like part of my motivation for this book as well, and this kind of lends itself into the title too, was, when I wrote Don't Ditch That Tech, like I was obviously very happy that we gotten the book done, but I was also kind of feeling unsatisfied by some of the answers that I had, developed and come up with in there philosophically. And part of that was because I felt like while we had addressed the technology component and how to better address student needs, we hadn't taken a look at the underlying pedagogy that was happening. And I felt like I needed to talk about that because I felt like there had also been a shift in my mind, especially in my own history teaching, that I needed to address in some way, shape, or form. And so that kind of then became the push for me to get that book done, or at least kind of the idea, of that book really. So I'll break the book down very, very quickly into it's really just 3 parts. So there are 3 models that are in the book. We have the movie theater model, we have the Blockbuster model, and then we have the streaming model. And eventually, and this is kind of what something, we have the last chapter, which talks about like the extended universe, and we can talk about what that looks like with AI now, because that's a little bit of a different twist that's been added in there since, in more recent times, we'll say. So the movie theater model. So what does it talk about? So the movie theater model is kind of the, exactly what you referred to earlier about like your student teacher who came in, had the idea that like I come in and I, do like a very kind of like traditional history experience about me standing up at the front of the room. And, it's more lecture based. It's a little bit more teacher centered usually. And what we do in the book is, and what I did is I really took time to take a look at that kind of teaching and learning model and to really break down like, what's the synthesis been on, does this work? What's the weaknesses and advantages of it? And how, if we have to do it, like, cause there are some times where like a really, really good lecture can, like change somebody's perspective. What's the ways that we could do it better? And so that's kind of what the first section focuses on. So, and I can dig into more details if you'd like to, but then the second chapter then gets to the Blockbuster, model itself, which is the name of the book. And really there I take on 2, but I'll say 3 main gripes of mine that really were kind of grinding my gears in education. And one was textbooks, which, as my contributing thought partner on the book, Matt was more than glad to hear me just go ahead and just keep, like taking a hard look at textbook and what we need to do with those. The second was homework. And then the third was grading. And really what the Blockbuster model represented for me in the book was these kind of like traditional practices that we always had assumed were going to be there in our classrooms and kind of are in need of a look to see like, do we still really need to be doing that? And for me, I felt like Blockbuster was a really good representation of that because, like Blockbuster, like I remember like going to Blockbuster with my parents and like, I would always assume like, yes, this is the way that we get video and digital content. Like if you want video games like to rent, or you want to go rent like a video game console, or you want to go rent a DVD or a VHS, this is how this is done. And very fortunately for us all, late fees, cough, cough. Some people took a hard look at that and were like, we could do this differently and it could be better than what it is right now. And so that kind of then became, for me, like the metaphor that I could attach to the second, section of the book. And then the third and the last chapter is then the streaming age. And so then I take a look at something that I developed when I was teaching, which was for me, like basically a better way to do flipped teaching, was something called the cloned classroom. And so the idea behind this, and again, kind of adopting its, same kind of the same metaphorical approach to like what it looks like to, be in the streaming age is like, what would it look like in education if we could make access as universal as possible? We could meet our students where they are in terms of where they want to learn. And how could we make the experience feel a little bit more student tailored and customized? And this is something that streaming apps do fantastically because, as soon as you like on Netflix, like finish watching a show, they're like, by the way, we think you would really like this. Right. And like, I was kind of like trying to take an approach in our design of our classrooms that, for me, like what the clone classroom is like, let's say that a student is going to be absent one day and then the next day they come back. they should have had every best possible chance and equitable opportunity in that day that they were gone for whatever reason, right? To be able to equitably access their education. Like, I'm going to give them the best shot possible. So this was not just like a flipped classroom where like they do like some of the instruction at home and some in person. It was truly a dual parallel experience that, even though it necessarily wasn't the same as them being there in person, yeah, I got it to be that way as close as possible to make sure that they could have universal access. And then the second thing that I kind of mentioned there was like the individualization component. So trying to come up with more kind of like tailored learning streams for my students, where if they were really interested in this one topic, they could decide to go deeper rather than follow than somebody who you have to watch only the top 10 on Netflix because that's what everybody in the class is doing, right? I wanted to come up with something that was a little bit more tailored and personalized. So
so many thoughts are going through my head, like as you're describing this, because I myself flipped my classroom and still do with my adult learners. And I've always told myself, if I were to go back to the high school classroom, there's a list in my head of how I would flip differently now.
Yeah.
And you kind of touched on it. And so like, I think one thing that I would do differently that I'm doing with my adult learners right now is like that in-class flip, where to address equitable issues of like internet, Wi-Fi, make sure they do it kind of, there's reasons there, perhaps more logistical, but this idea of cloning, if I'm understanding this correctly, like you're basically replicating what you're doing synchronously and making it asynchronous in probably an engaging way, right?
That's exactly right. You've got it. And so like when I talk about this in the book, like I do obviously give the preface, like you cannot create this overnight. Like it takes a while, right? But like for example, like one thing that I would do with my kids is so like there's this graphing calculator app out there called Desmos, okay? Which any math teacher probably has heard of. Well, my approach to that, because like I was having my kids learn about something, and this was a lesson we were doing on the Russian Revolution, which is already really hard for kids to understand, right? Because they're not from there, and all the names tend to sound the same for kids who don't understand Russian history. And I had one group of students who were there in person, and we were using Desmos, which seems like why are you using a graphing calculator app? Well, it has this ability, this app on it that allows you to play Guess Who games on there. And so for students who were in class, they were able to play that with the students who were still able to be absent at the same time. And so like, because I was like really struggling, like racking my brain, I was like, man, like these kids need something interactive and something fun that they can play, where like they can work on some of these difficult but seemingly like similarly sounding names and people and events. And I was like, I'm going to give the kids who are in class the chance to play this, and the kids who are out of class, they can also play this too. And so like that yes, you have nailed the exact essence of what the streaming model is. But again, that takes time to set up, and it's not something that you can do right away. And so what I did is I kind of approached it very, very gradually. Like I would get one lesson cloned, and then I would move on to the next one. But every the wonderful thing about it is for me is it became, even though it was a little bit of a time investment up front, getting like, okay, if I'm going to have a kid do a warm up, and like let's say who knows what application I was using, if it was Class Time or Pear Deck, or I would have like just a ton of them that I would have them use. Is that as soon as they get in, there's an embedded PowerPoint on there. Everybody's going to have that on their device. I'll also have it up on the screen. We'll utilize it together, right? In the class, the kids at home, they also can utilize all the same links are there. And I kind of had this like all laid out in these PowerPoints that kids could use. And everything was there that they could possibly need. And the wonderful thing about it was then when the kids came back and they were like, what did I miss? I was like, it's all online, man. Just, it's all there. Like I didn't have to make sub plans. I didn't need to make like late work folders. None of that. If kids want to be like, well, what did I miss? I don't remember anything from that lesson. It's all there, man. Like that's what's wonderful about it, is that it's all, like I'm not hiding anything from you, right?
I think, yeah, like I was probably at my high school, I was probably the only one that was flipping. So I was like the outlier, the weird one in the corner that was, they're like, oh, he's doing something very different, right?
Yeah, that was me at my high school. They were like, you should flip your classroom. I'm like, I could, but like, what if I did it more than that? And that was kind of like the spawn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
people were like, why are your kids not coming to your class? I was like, they can choose to come or they can choose not to. I'm okay with either one.
Right.
Yeah.
But like going back to that topic of like investment, right? Which it is an investment. It took me a few years because I taught Gov, Econ, and World. So those are like 3 different things that needed a lot of content. Yeah. And so the biggest payoff though, and you touched on this way early on in this episode, was just the ease of analytics and data.
Yeah.
Because that is I feel like a missing piece generally across like all of education. At least more like at the grassroots level, right? Where like I remember, and again, going back to my student teacher, that like the last one I had there, she was blown away with like, wait, you know so much about what they know and at any given time. I'm like, yeah, like if you have that type of insight, you're not guessing. It's not guess and check. It's straight up, this is how we pivot, this is how we move, and this is how you know which learners, like in small groups, like which ones can go deeper, which ones need to pull back and be like, okay, cool, like this is what we're doing over here, and how the differentiation just takes it to a different level in my view. So I don't know what your experiences were with all that, but like part of that investment was the ease of data, and once it's built, you will now have different visibility.
Yeah, and for me, I kind of have mixed feelings about the data, but from maybe an angle you may not understand. So like one is that like yes, I did obviously have like a ton of data that was available on my kids, right? Like I knew when they were logged on, I knew what they knew, right? I had a good understanding of what their like their writing ability was. Like, I had like a good anecdotal data too, right? About like I knew like I could tell from like when they were accessing resources and like how many activities and assignments they were completing, how much they were studying, right? But then for every ed tech app that your kids use, and this is something that's just true generally across the board, excuse me, is that every single time they use a different ed tech app, especially if those apps do not have any interoperability between one another, you've created another data silo. And for me, like something that I've become not necessarily concerned about, but I always want to make educators aware of, is that when they're beginning to utilize ed tech in their classroom, is that as soon as let's say that you and a teacher down the hall, right? One of you is using Cami, one's on Pear Deck, one's on Nearpod, one's on, CurryPod, right? Or we can keep going down the list. That's 4 different data silos that do not right now, as of this recording, do not have the ability to pull data together that somebody could get a unified insight from as to what their kids are learning, right? And for me, like, again, I always am, I always just kind of preface when I tell teachers, like, start implementing ed tech. Yes, but... and usually I'm a kind of yes and person because I like improv, but like, yes, but there is a cost, to creating a new place that is going to have insight into your children. And that is kind of the other question about like, what could others also learn from it, but they can't because they might not have access. Right. Does that kind of make sense?
It makes so much sense. And you were like in the moment shifting my perspective on this topic. The way you put it, these data silos of just how, and because the first thing that I thought about was like, I was using, like, I had like 3 go-to ed tech tools.
Yeah.
Almost for the sake of not overwhelming the kids, right? Be like, cool, these are my 3 or 4
great practice. Yes.
go-tos, right?
Mm-hmm.
But oftentimes when I was, especially in my early years of implementation, the data that was in these tools versus what was in the final grade book, it's
Mm-hmm.
almost like there had to have been a level of inaccuracy as a result of what you're describing here,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like how are you using all of them? Is more of a formative context? Is it more of a summative? Is it
Mm-hmm.
a like I would say a temperature check is not always the same as a formative, right?
No, no.
And so like what does all of it mean if it's
Mm-hmm.
not being housed in a way that is in the same place, A, but also B, that there's relationships there in trends and what does it
Mm-hmm.
all mean when it's all housed in the same place?
Yeah. And that's not to say like that, educators can't have their own way of keeping data. Because we even did this
Right.
before there was ed tech, right? Like you would have a kid like slap a post-it note on the door. And like,
Sure.
a person down the hall can't see that, right? Like because again, they're down the hall. They can't, see like what's going on the inside of your classroom. And not to, say that like everybody should know everything that your kids, know at any given time. But like there
Right.
is, at least in a lot of the districts that, I have worked and I've consulted with, is that there has become, like somewhat of and I wouldn't say a backlash, but like, again, just a concern that, we're putting too many things in too many different places. And for kids, and this is kind of what you spoke to as well, is that like, okay, for Mr. Ridgway, I have to use these 3 apps. For Mr. Martinez, like I need these 4 or these 3, and they're sometimes they're not the same, right? And so like it becomes a a thing on them too. And that notwithstanding, then there's also parents and families you have to think about too, about that, the insight that they have into how their kids are doing. Because grades are not exactly what we'll call it the least effective way to understand how your students are doing at any given time. So
yeah, and there's you can err on either side of that, right? Like you can let teachers do whatever they want, and then like kind of like you said, like they're all doing different things. But if a leader were to, hey, here's our app portal, then teachers feel like, oh, I don't have choice over what it gets super complicated. Yeah, no doubt. With the time that we have left, Nate, like because I do know that you have a book up and coming. That you're working on.
Still hacking away at it.
So it looks like AI is involved with it, as well as the pedagogy and the creativity. I'm curious to hear just a little bit about it and like what folks should expect out of it.
Yeah, so I really am wanting to take kind of my swipe at where I feel like the intersection of ed tech and also UDL to an extent, because I can't leave that part of it out of there. I just can't help myself. But also really then I really want to think about how we think about design and about creation. Not necessarily about creativity, although it kind of does, tangentially reflect upon that. But I really wanted to take a moment to think about, ed tech, accessibility, and then the kind of the state of where things are right now in education. And I think that's kind of what all of my books have done to an extent. But this one is, again, just kind of more addressing the recent things with AI. So for me, like I want to kind of look at 2 key things, and this is what I've kind of put on the blog as kind of like my main like driving questions forward, is that I want to look at the, because again, we're in this generative AI, kind of moment, right? Where there's all these questions about like who owns this, right? About like when a generative AI model makes something, right? Because there's also, copyright, concerns around that. But then there's also lots of questions for teachers too about like, if a student uses AI, is that actually the student's work, or is it something that's like, is it a hybrid, or is it not the student's work at all? And depending on who you ask, they will have very, very passionate feelings about that. And so what I want to do in kind of 2 things is like, one is like, I want to take a look at, the very core essence of what makes us creative, or at least designers really as humans. And I want to kind of look at what that process can and should feel like, both from an educator's perspective, but then also a student perspective as well. Because I think students need a chance to play and to be creative. And that's something that I'm going to talk about pretty directly in the book, because I feel like that's something that's kind of, for me, like I noticed this especially over the holiday break when I was taking time away from my kids. It's like I had time to play with my kids, and I can't remember the last time that like I had time with my students just to do that, is to like play and invent dumb stuff, right? And then the second thing is I want to look at then with that in mind about how humans create, and like again I'm going to kind of, in the book I will kind of define that as like that's really what makes us humans, is that we can we can be innovative and we can be creative, right? We can design unique solutions to problems. Is that okay? With that in mind, how do we approach this AI thing with thinking about equity and accessibility? Because for me, like that layers in a whole nother a whole nother can of worms about what it means about like what creativity and feedback can look like. Like we can talk about that element of it. We could look at like how could students and teachers maybe leverage this for brainstorming capabilities, but then still utilize it as something that's like I can get a bunch of solutions or ideas, solutions from Chat GPT or Gemini or whatever I happen to be using. But could I take that in a way then that can still inspire me to go do something else, right? Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of it is going to be breaking down a lot of the myths and conceptions, and just again kind of breaking, not to borrow our previous title, about how we think about who owns what we make and how we feel about what people make, whether it's our students or ourselves, kind of in this new kind of age, especially when it regards to education. So that's kind of where that's kind of like my very brief overview and synopsis of what I'm kind of working on, thinking on so far.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love the idea of like someone like yourself, like disaggregating that a little, to a degree, and really like when we see it in pieces, I think it helps the broader audience understand like this new kind of sometimes scary thing that we're
part of it is going to have to talk about AI literacy, because like people need to know how these things work, right? Like a lot of folks, like when like teachers casually run into AI the first time, they might not even realize that they've actually been like a lot of folks don't even realize this technology has been with us a very, very long time. It just has a new face and name, and that's why it's intimidating, right? Like YouTube utilizes algorithms, which are the basis of a lot of AI, deep thinking models. And then even like when you get onto your phone and it does facial recognition, right? Like that is a basis of how a lot of these very, very advanced programs work, is pattern recognition, right? So like a lot of it is going to be demystifying some of those components, but not to say that they also don't have really, really big concerns too, right? Like, I think there is a lot of valid questions about like if you give a student an essay prompt and the student slaps the essay prompt into Chat GPT, whether or not that's actually their writing or somebody else's, right? But that then involves, okay, so what do you do with that? Like, do you take time with your students and parents and families and help break down your understanding of that, and like what that looks and feels like? So in my college course that I recently taught here, my approach to AI with the kids was, I will let you use AI on whatever you want to for any class assignment. The only thing you have to do is you have to tell me if you use it. That's it. And so that way I can know whose writing I'm grading, right? Am I grading the prompt that you engineered to put in there when you decided to put that into a homework assignment? Or am I grading the actual like I need to know, like I need some background, I need some context, right? And usually like when I would give kids writing assignments then in class, because they were doing it with a paper and a pencil, there wasn't a chance there to use AI, so the results that I got them were very different, right? But a lot of it is just going to be kind of taking some time and thinking about, okay, so you want to do this, so what's the cost and how do we break it down and how do we better understand it?
That's it. Yeah, I love that approach. The just tell me what you did. And yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. We're getting up to the end here, Nate. And so one thing that we always ask our guest, and you may have already touched on it, but right now, what is top of mind for you in education?
I've got a few things that I'm kind of rattling around in my brain. One is a rather controversial question that I've been thinking about, but for me, which kind of like hurts my heart that I'm thinking about it, but is have we differentiated too far? And what I mean by that is that part of education and part of what we seek as educators is a community of students who can work and who can function and can learn from each other, right? And I wonder, and again, this is something that I'm thinking about as I'm kind of working on this next book and as I'm kind of meditating on, is that as we are seeking so much that like this, like this app can individualize your education for you, right? Or like this app is going to give your students customized writing feedback on just their writing, right? And the more that I think about it, I don't think there's necessarily such a thing as differentiating too far, as much as are we losing out on some of those larger communal moments of learning and conversation from each other, that because we are so invested, especially after COVID, about like, well, you're going to be sitting behind a screen by yourself in a room for hours, and you're not going to be talking or, learning or, reading facial expressions or body language or communicating or having dialogue with people back and forth. And that's something that I'm kind of trying to, for me, like I'm thinking about it the more and more that I see a lot of these ed tech apps and, educators out there who are very genuinely, rightly so, like excited about, delivering really customized learning for their kids. I keep thinking about and keep coming back to this idea that like we do still need to have moments of shared vulnerability and learning from one another about where we are in our educational journeys. And so, but regardless of content area or profession, that's just kind of something that I've been thinking about.
That is interesting, because at the end of the day, we still want to make sure that we're humanizing the profession and doing it in a way that, yeah, the tool can be involved with that, but we should not expect to have it do
it can't build relationships, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Love that. Yeah. And as time goes on, like obviously these tools are going to change, adapt, and evolve. My big hope, though, and not to toot my own horn or anything, but like I feel one thing that my company does well is listen to that teacher input, to that leader input of like what is working, what's not. I just hope that that enough of them are going to do that.
Yeah.
To make sure that, because the things that are going to be needed in even just 10 years is going to be different than this moment. So yeah, no, Nate, we really appreciate you coming on, being a part of this conversation, being a part of the show.
Thanks for having me, Steve. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, and for everybody that is listening, watching, putting up Nate's website here. I believe that's the correct one there. Yeah.
That's correct.
Blockbuster.com. Yep. And so just putting it up on screen there. Good stuff. I was kind of poking my way through this earlier today. It's a great way. And Nate, correct me if I'm wrong. It's a great place to find you.
Yeah, it's I haven't posted on there very recently just because we had our third baby here really recently. So, but I should
Congrats.
be here. Oh, thanks. He's fun. He's very easy, which is thank God for the third kid that he's easy. But there will be lots more coming there soon. I have no doubt. So
yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Cool. I'll be sure to drop this episode today. It'll have Nate's links. Nate, I believe like your main place of presence is the Sky. Is that
yeah, for just like general social media. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. All right, friends. Well, we're going to call this an episode. This has been a lot of fun. Nate, hopefully we get to collaborate and chat again in the future. But for everyone that is listening, watching, keep your hats on, but your minds open. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.